Senator Tom Cotton just can't seem to help himself. On an interview he did quite recently with the Arkansas Democratic Gazette, the Little Rock-based newspaper, he was talking about revisionist history in the 1619 Project, which is an arm of the New York Times, which seeks to, in their words, educate America about slavery and things of the sort. Now, the 1619 Project, admittedly, is not the most unbiased source of information. In fact, they have a slant. They have said some things that are not necessarily very charitable towards the American experiment, and things that I think should be thoroughly refuted or engaged with in an intellectually honest way. Cotton didn't do this. Cotton simply used a very blanket tactic, a very blanket rhetorical tool, which appeals to preconceived notions, and said that the 1619 Project, or a revisionist group, it's always those revisionists, isn't it? A revisionist group that is trying to indoctrinate children about mistruths of American history, and that we should understand the actions of certain people in American history in their context. Now, the latter I absolutely agree with. We do need to understand things in their context, because without context, you have nothing except your contemporary context, your contemporary mindsets, which may indeed sully the waters great unfairly for the people who may have existed in a time where your contemporary context does not necessarily matter or did not necessarily have any sway, which certainly didn't have any sway. However, the former statement about revisionism is largely, I think, sensationalism, because there have been political actors on both sides of the aisle, both right-wing and left-wing actors, who have indeed tried to indoctrinate people into their own views. Public education itself is a ruse. It is a ruse because public education is taught by the people that have most power. If it is funded by the government, and the government changes hands every 2 or 3 or 4 years, depending on what level of the government you have, then public education itself is simply an indoctrination arm of the government, which is why homeschooling and charter schools and private schools are very good. So I don't mind those things. So I think they are indispensable to having a free-thinking mind. Or I would even say, beyond any sort of schooling, how about independent study? I did a lot of independent study in my days. I have read a lot. I've Plato, Nietzsche, Emerson, all of them on my own. And you can all do that too if you have access to a computer. But public education itself is just a ruse. But instead of talking about any of those things, Cotton immediately proceeds to shoot himself in his already naked Achilles heel. He says, as the Founding Fathers said, slavery was the necessary evil which would come to extinction as the American experiment continued. Now, of course, Tom Cotton has immediately tried to clarify his statements after receiving big backlash from a lot of folks on the left. He has said, oh no, I was quoting what the Founding Fathers said and what they believed. But that wasn't necessarily true. He may have been doing that, but he didn't make the statements in a way that could accurately distance himself from that sentiment. He could have said, well, according to the founders, I don't share this view, but according to the founders, slavery was X, Y, and Z. That would have been a fine statement to make. But he basically concurred in an indirect way. And so what I really want to focus on, not what Tom Cotton said or what he doesn't say, because Tom Cotton is a man that exists in temporal space who, like all of us, is getting closer and closer and closer to different changes in lives and different changes in his thoughts and everything, or different changes in his development and growth. I mean, temporalness, time itself, changes and shifts the seas and the waves of our lives. So I don't want to think about Tom Cotton. I want to think about universal principles, because universal principles will exist long after I'm gone, he's gone, and we're all gone. They will persist and continue to persist throughout generations and posterity. The idea of a necessary evil, where does that come from? The idea that, something is indispensable to a particular facet of society, a particular facet of existence, and therefore must be necessary. In the context of the American Revolution and everything that happened thereafter, it could be argued that indeed slavery was indispensable to people who ran the cotton fields, people who ran plantations, people who ran, and all of them were deeply politically invested in America, absolutely. But this was not even clear amongst the founders. A lot of the founders had a lot of anger or disapproval of slavery. Even Thomas Jefferson, one of the most complex and nuanced founders in the history of our founding fathers, didn't like slavery even though he owned slaves. He had a cognitive dissonance about it. In fact, a draft of the Declaration of Independence, an initial draft, had an anti-slavery provision. But unfortunately, there were political actors in his time that did not want him to put forth that draft.
And I quote, He, meaning the king, has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights to life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere. He is determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold. He has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or restrain this execrable commerce. We don't say execrable very much anymore, but it means detestable, abhorrent, an abomination, very, very bad. So this is Jefferson.
So, to say that all the founders saw it as necessary evil is not true. It's not being very charitable towards the American tradition. But to even use the term necessary evil to try to describe this is also not being charitable to conceptual righteousness. Simple. Evil is evil. In fact, Ayn Rand said there is no lesser of two evils. There is evil and then there is evil. It all depends on what evil you are willing to accept and what evil you're willing to endorse. Evil is evil. Nothing is necessary for human life to flourish except our innate freedom. Period. On a principle level, nothing is necessary for human life to flourish except our innate freedom. It is not necessary. It wasn't even necessary back then for folks to enslave other human beings, to force them against their will. Number one, it's not morally correct, number one. Number two, it wasn't efficient. And number three, they had to do a lot of runaways and a lot of other problems that could have been easily avoided if they had simply solicited voluntary labor. So slavery was not even a necessary anything. But the idea of slavery, I'm about to give you a secret, the idea of slavery was seen as indispensable to life because that had been the way of life so many people throughout the ancient world and the contemporary American world had understood. That had been the way of life that so many folks had been accustomed to. The only thing slavery was necessary for was the preservation of certain mindsets, the propagation of certain ideas, not the propagation or the preservation of America, American society, or most importantly, the individual. But no, he wants to continue to use false dichotomies to try to explain these things in an effort to ensure historical fairness. You can ensure historical fairness, Tom Cotton, by number one, accurately depicting what the founders believed. Most of them, a lot of them were against slavery. And number two, actively trying to understand on a conceptual level why there are no necessary evils, there are only convenient evils. There are no necessary evils, there are only convenient evils. Nothing is necessary for the flourishing of human life or American society, especially American society, given the foundation that is built upon, except the gift of human freedom, which is innate to every single man. As John Locke said in the Second Treatise of Government, there is no vile estate of man than slavery. It is a vile estate of man. It is external to our being. It is not something that is propitious to the advancement of humanity. That was the second or our first treatise. One of them. I've read both, but Dave gets foggy over time. And so, when you see these kind of dichotomies, guys, try to understand that you don't have to buy into them. You choose to. You don't have to vote for a Democrat or Republican. You choose to. If you wanted to break through a third-party independent voice, you could. But you don't have to. There is no lesser of two evils. There is evil, period. And you're going to get a diluted kind of evil or a more nefarious kind of evil, but you're still going to get evil. It is our duty to test goodness so we can see if it be goodness. It is our duty to let that essence of our mind flow out into the political landscape and overtake everything that is not wrong and convert it, transmute it into everything that is right. It is our divine duty as Americans who have been invested with such powerful conceptual energy to ensure that the tradition of American freedom flows eternally. That's our duty. But we don't accomplish that duty by binding ourselves to false dichotomies, evil one, evil two, it's both evil, stop it, don't buy into it on a conceptual level, on a logical level, on a philosophical level, it is still evil. Evil is evil, fight evil, don't embrace evil. And Tom Cotton, you would do best to read a little bit more about this kind of stuff. Made me think about it too. Just saying. Until next time, guys, stay pensive.